And that was the cover.
That was the cover of Time magazine. Man of the Year is Adolf Hitler. Let me go in here so I don't kill myself. It's 1938, and the world is going crazy. Adolf Hitler is the Man of the Year. My name is Evan Weiner, I did this talk because of Kristallnacht. I didn't have Hamas and Israel in mind when I wrote this thing up one day, and I said, you know, I want to do 1938. So, 1938, Time magazine, Hitler of the Year, and Time magazine had lots of reasons it claimed for naming Hitler the Man of the Year. And there is Austria, and Hitler takes over Austria. The Avian Conference, we found out that Jews...
Just pull it.
Yeah, sure.
Otherwise I have to hear that thing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, that is the Avian Conference.
Yeah.
And that's where we find out that Jews are not welcomed in other countries trying to escape Hitler. The Munich Agreement, 1938, and there is Hitler in the middle of that. Jewish repression, Kristallnacht, Germany, 1938. But there was a place for a haven for Jews, Shanghai in China.
Yeah.
And Kristallnacht, of course. Statue of Liberty says, no, we're not taking you in. You know, you can look at the Statue of Liberty, but we don't want you. There was a Spanish Civil War. There was an Arab revolt in 1938, and we are now talking about 85 years later, and nothing has changed. Absolutely nothing has changed, this Arab revolt. There was a recession in 1938, and yesterday was the 85th anniversary of the fake radio war, which stirs terror through the United States. That was, of course, Orson Welles. And also in 1938, Abbott and Costello introduced Who's On First on the Kate Smith Show. And there was plenty of hate radio in 1938. That is Father Charles Coughlin, who probably is the father of hate radio, which continues to this day, although it's covered up a little bit better than Coughlin, who is just really raw. And he's in Detroit. He's actually in Royal Oak, Michigan. And there's another guy in the Detroit area who's hitting a lot of home runs, Hank Greenberg. And there's also another guy who's from the Detroit area named Joe Louis, who's facing Germany's Max Schmeling in a fight. Superman is born, as is the March of Dimes. But we're going back to the causes of Hitler's hatred of Jews. That's Kaiser Wilhelm overlooking the troops back in World War I. The First World War and its subsequent peace settlements gave rise to new ambitions, rivalries, and tensions. People had high expectations that the post-war peace settlement would create a new world order. That is something you hear about all the time, New World Order. Nobody's ever explained what it is, but it's being used to slam some people or bolster other politicians. But nobody's ever really explained what the New World Order is. And ensure that the slaughter of the First World War would never be repeated. Treaty of Versailles, the Big Four, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Now, the Treaty of Versailles probably is where the Holocaust really starts in Germany. It was signed in June 1919, created the League of Nations, an international body intended to promote peace and prevent war. However, the treaty was an uneasy compromise as the victorious allies, which were Britain and America, France and Italy, well, they had their own ideas of what should happen in Europe, particularly in the old German territory, or in the German territory. Germany was forced to surrender territory, disarm, pay for war damages. These decisive conditions were criticized as overly vindictive by many in Britain and in America. The treaty's terms caused immediate outrage and lasting bitterness in Germany. But there's an irony in this whole thing. the irony is that Germany actually would emerge a lot stronger than the people who came up with the Versailles Treaty thought they should have or would. It's kind of interesting because the Treaty of Versailles left Germany in a very surprisingly strong geostrategical position. Poland was created, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, and the treaty put buffer zones between Germany and one of its traditional rivals, Russia. All of a sudden, there's a little padding between the two of them. Fighting among the new states weakened them. The geography of their new borders made it difficult to defend. So Germany emerges from the war with a small, relatively weak set of states on its eastern border. Well, the formal end of World War I comes in 1923 with the Treaty of Lausanne, Switzerland. Senior statesmen were working on the treaty, but they stopped in June 1919. And, well, there were informal talks, and by July 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed by France, Britain, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, and the new Republic of Turkey. So why did Hitler hate Jews so much? Why did he feel that the solution to all the problems, at least in Europe, was to get rid of all the Jews? Well, the big lie. The big lie. That he believed the big lie. Now, Hitler was from Austria. He was not German. During World War I, between 1914 and 1918, Hitler was a soldier of the German army, even though he was Austrian. At the end of the war, he and many other German soldiers like him couldn't get over the defeat of the German Empire. And here comes the lie, the big lie. The German Army Command spread the myth that the army had not lost on the battlefield, but they were betrayed. The stab in the back. Who stabbed them in the back? Guess who? The Jews. Hitler bought into the myth. Jews and communists had betrayed the country and brought a left-wing government to power that had wanted to throw in the towel. Hitler would be arrested, go to jail, and while he was in jail, he writes Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. I don't know what his struggle was, but he had a struggle. He predicted a general European war that would result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. This guy was obscure. This guy was a nobody. Nobody. Or as Mel Brooks said, he was one hell of a painter. He could paint one room, 2 coats, all in the afternoon. Anyway, Mein Kampf was written in jail. He was arrested for his participation of the Beer Hall Push in Munich on November 9th and 10th, 1923, when the Nazi Party tried to overthrow the government. And this guy should have been away in jail forever, except he's released in December 1924. So why did Hitler hate the Jews? This is 1922, Nazi Party members. Well, the Nazis hated the Jews because they were able to blame the Jews for their defeat in World War I. Hitler created a stereotypical enemy. In the 1920s and 1930s, the defeated country was in a major crisis, and Herbert Hoover, during 1932, President of the United States, decided to call in the German loans. And the Germans couldn't pay back, which would lead to the rise of Hitler. According to the Nazis, expelling the Jews was the solution to their problems in Germany. On February 25th, 1932, Hitler became a citizen of Germany. He was born in Austria. He immigrated to Germany in 1913, renounced his Australian citizenship in 1925. There was a political message that the Nazis sent out, and there was a promise: make Germany economically strong again. And Hitler's party won the elections. But he wasn't the guy in charge. This guy was the guy in charge. A guy by the name of Paul Hindenburg, who was quite elderly. He was an octogenarian. He was president of Germany. And on January 30th, 1933, von Hindenburg names Hitler leader, or the Führer, of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, as the Chancellor of Germany. Hitler's plan? Well, you can't become the head of a country without the people supporting you. And the Germans supported him. You know, even though years later, I'm just following orders. Well, you weren't. You made him your leader. And what he wanted to do, get rid of politics. Have Germany as a powerful, united, one-party state, the Nazi state. And then he starts thumbing his, he starts sticking his fingers in the eyes of people around the world. Germany's not allowed to have an army. They're not allowed to have an air force. And guess what? Luftwaffe. All of a sudden, in 1935, he forms it. Direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In the United States, they know something is going on. The 1936 Olympics were to be held in Berlin in the summer and the Munich area in the winter. The Germans had actually cut a deal with a guy by the name of Rudolf Ball, who was a Jew who was on the German hockey team, and he was the best player. And they said, look, you play for us during the Winter Olympics, and we'll let you go. And he cut the deal, and the Ball family left. But Ernest Janke knows that things are going wrong in Germany, and he should know because he was a former high government in the United States official. 1936 Berlin Olympics. Before I go on with that, I am in the very unique position that the three most prominent Jews who were supposed to perform in 1936, Marty Glickman, who I worked for, Sam Stoller, who I knew, he ran the Melrose Games, and in my job as a journalist, I interviewed Gretel Bergman. She was the quote-unquote Hitler's pawn. She was the best female athlete in Europe at the time, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. Janke was an American International Olympic Committee delegate, and he was outraged with the reports of what was happening within Hitler's Germany. On May 25th, 1935, Janke sends a letter to the International Olympic Committee President, Count Henri Beloeil Latour. These guys think they're important, but they're not. But they think they're important, the leaders in the International Olympic Committee. By the way, you probably don't know this, but the International Olympic Committee has permanent observer status at the United Nations, along with the Vatican, and that's that. So, let's boycott. The letter seems to go unanswered. What he said, neither Americans nor the representatives of other countries can take part in the games in Nazi Germany without at least acquiescing in the contempt of the Nazis for fair play and their sordid exploitation of the games. He was a former assistant secretary for the United States Navy. He was also of German descent, and he gets thrown out of the exclusive club called the International Olympic Committee, and his spot was taken by Avery Brundage, a racist and an anti-Semite. I first learned of this guy by going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. His name is Judge Jeremiah Mahoney. He has a little plaque in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And it's an area where non-Jews are saluted for their help in trying to either prevent the Holocaust or getting people out of Europe. He's the head of the Amateur Athletic Association. And he's got a big concern. And he does not want the Americans at the Berlin Olympics. In April 1933, an Aryans-only policy was instituted in all German athletic organizations. Non-Aryans, Jews or individuals with Jewish parents and Roma, gypsies, were systematically excluded from German sports facilities and associations. This is what he said. There's no room for discrimination on grounds of race, color, or creed in the Olympics. The AAU, and they're the people who chose the people to go on the American Olympic team, voted in 1933 to accept an invitation to compete in Berlin, provided Germany pledged that there would be no discrimination against Jewish athletes. If that pledge is not kept, I personally do not see why we should compete. He went on a tour of America with the New York Governor, Al Smith, and others, saying, hey, look, we cannot go to the Olympics. What is going on in Germany is absolutely terrible. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt he had a different idea. No bully pulpit pressure from him. He said, look, they're athletes. They're not politicians. They don't have to decide what's going on in the world. Just let them compete. And, well, you know, I asked Marty Glickman about that one day. And he said, you know, I wanted to go. And Marty was scheduled to race until he was pulled at the last minute with Sam Stoller. He was replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf. And I said, well, why'd you want to go? He said, because I wanted to win that gold medal in the 4x100 meter relay. And I was going to get on that podium and I was going to stick that medal right into the Fuhrer's face. Unfortunately, he never did. But for the first time in the history of the modern Olympics, people in the United States and Europe called for a boycott of the Olympics because of what later would become known as human rights abuses. And this is what the American team saw when they walked into the stadium, the Heil Hitler salute, Heil Hitler. Brundage had assurances from Adolf Hitler, all was good, all was cool. Certain Jews must understand they cannot use these games as a weapon in their boycott against the Nazis, said Brundage, who labeled the anti-Olympic campaign as a Jewish communist conspiracy. Some American newspapers called Avery Brundage a Nazi stooge. It's probably the nicest thing that you can say about him, absolute nicest. He would go on after the Olympics, his construction company would build buildings in Washington, D.C. for the Nazis, for the embassy there. Here's the games. The games are there. That's what you see, Nazi swastikas. I once did a talk up in Stamford, Connecticut, and this has to be 10 years ago, since this guy was in his late 80s at the time. And he was telling me in 1933, his parents exiled him to London. His father was a newspaper editor, and then they ended up going to Prague. I didn't ask him what happened after Prague. And he said, yeah, I'm going to see my parents. I'm 16 years old, going through Germany. And he said, it's okay prior to the Olympics. The Olympics are over, I'm traveling back through Germany, and it's back to you dirty Jew, which was the nicest thing they said to him, and all that other stuff. So the Nazis were successful in camouflaging, at least during the Olympics, its violent racist policies while it hosted the Summer Olympics. Most anti-Jewish signs were temporarily removed. Newspapers toned down the harsh rhetoric. It was all an illusion, that's all it was. The Berlin Games presented to foreign spectators and journalists with a false image of a peaceful, tolerant Germany, or as Mel Brooks wrote, the Hitler with his song in his heart. Germany did have its propaganda coup. Nobody stopped them. 49 nations sent teams to Berlin, which legitimized the Hitler regime in the eyes of the world and the German domestic audiences. Hitler saw that, and there was no turning back. As far as Marty Glickman, if you talk to him and ask him about the Olympics, he would curse out Avery Brundage. As far as Sam Stoller, who was supposed to run in that 4x100 relay race, didn't say anything. Didn't think that because he was Jewish, he was pulled from the race, but it was the most humiliating day of his life. As far as Gretel Bergman, who I interviewed in 1993, she was Hitler's pawn. But, as she said, she was competing on the German national team. She knew she was never going to make the Olympics. But she said, I got to give my people some hope. We have no hope. We have absolutely no hope. Everything's been taken away from us. I thought maybe, just maybe, I can give them a ray of sunshine. She left Germany with $20 in her pocket with her boyfriend, Dr. Bruno Lambert. They settled in Forest Hills, and she lived to the ripe old age of 103, passing away in 2017 in Forest Hills in Queens. Meanwhile, let's take Austria. I'm a former citizen, and on March 12th, German troops marched into Austria. The Austrian Nazis conspired for the second time in 4 years to seize the Austrian government by force and unite their nation with Nazi Germany. On March 13th, Hitler appointed a new Nazi government in Austria. Hitler is on tour. The Avian Conference. Franklin Roosevelt knows things are getting bad. Things are getting really, really bad. And he decides it's time for the world leaders to do something about at least getting some people out of Germany and into other countries. It's in France, the Avian Conference, convened by Roosevelt to deal with the Jewish refugee problem, held in Avian between July 6th and the 15th. After Germany annexed Austria in March, Roosevelt called for an international conference to promote the immigration of Austrian and German Jewish refugees and create an international organization whose purpose would be to deal with the general refugee population. The President invited delegates from 32 countries, including the United States, Great Britain, France, 6 small European democratic nations, Latin American nations, Australia, and New Zealand. When he proposed the conference, Roosevelt made it clear that no country would be forced to change its immigration quotas, but instead be asked to volunteer changes. The United States Reed-Johnson Act in 1924 basically got rid of the Jewish problem. They called it the Eastern European problem. If you were from Eastern Europe, there were quotas on you. They went back to the 1890 census to see who the immigrants were prior to 1890, and they were from England and Ireland and those places. And they said, instead of looking at, say, the 1900 or 19-teens or 1920 census, we'll go back all that time, which was 35 years, and we'll keep those Jews out. And that's what they did. Reed-Johnson Immigration Act. During the conference, it became obvious that no country, including the United States, was willing to volunteer. The Dominican Republic, a tiny country, volunteered to take in refugees in exchange for huge amounts of money. And there are some Jews that ended up in the Dominican Republic. The Munich Agreement. This is what makes Hitler the man of the year, and Neville Chamberlain, a footnote in history, a bad footnote in history. So this is the Time magazine description. Greatest single news event of 1938 took place on September 29th when 4 statesmen met at the Führerhaus in Munich to redraw the map of Europe. The 3 visiting statesmen at the historic conference were Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain, Premier Eduardo Daladier of France, and the dictator Benito Mussolini of Italy. By all odds, the dominating figure at Munich was the German host, Adolf Hitler. And there is Chamberlain, and there is Hitler, face to face. Führer of the German people, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, Navy, and Air Force, Chancellor of the Third Reich, Herr Hitler reaped on that day at Munich the harvest of an audacious, defiant, ruthless foreign policy he had pursued for 5.5 years. He had torn the Treaty of Versailles to shreds. He rearmed Germany to the teeth, or as close to the teeth as he was able. He had stolen Austria before the eyes of a horrified and apparently impotent world. All these events were shocking to nations which defeated Germany on the battlefield only 20 years before, but nothing so terrified the world as the ruthless, methodical, Nazi-directed events which during the late summer and early autumn threatened a world war over Czechoslovakia. Another picture of Chamberlain and Hitler. When, without the loss of blood, he reduced Czechoslovakia to a German puppet state, forced a drastic revision of Europe's defensive alliances, and won a free hand for himself in Eastern Europe by getting a hands-off promise from powerful Britain and later France, Adolf Hitler, without doubt, became 1938's Man of the Year. The world didn't step. He knew the world wasn't going to stop him. He found that out in 1936. He found that out in 1935. Of course, there was a depression that people were dealing with as well, but people were still tired of World War I. They didn't care. And in subsequent years, surveys of Americans said, you know, we're not interested in Europe. Chamberlain, the great appeaser. Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Is best known for his role in the Munich Agreement in 1938, which ceded parts of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. Chamberlain flew to Berlin on September 15, 1938 in an attempt to secure peace. And he's got the paper, and he says, peace for our time, but not really. Oh, if you were in Czechoslovakia, they didn't tell you anything about this Munich Agreement. In fact, they basically said, if you try to rise up against Hitler, you're on your own, boys. We're not helping you. That's it. The deal was done on September 30th. Chamberlain, believing he had averted war, proclaimed peace for our time to a crowd upon his arrival in England. And the Nazis were going after Jews, and you had to wear the yellow star, Jude, and some people had to change their name to make sure that their name sounded Jewish, even if they were Jewish but didn't have a Jewish-sounding name. On October 5th, Jews' passports were invalidated, and those who needed a passport for immigration purposes were given one marked with the letter J, Jew, Jew. Another law from 1938 required Jews who did not have a typically Jewish name to add one. Men were forced to add the name Israel and women Sarah, so they would be easily recognized as Jews. On October 27th, Nazi Germany carried out the brutal eviction of Jews with Polish citizenship, the first mass deportation of Jews. SS men drove children, elderly, and the sick across the Polish border, most of them concentrated in abandoned stables. And the world is watching and doing nothing. The Nazi Minister of Economics, Walter Funk, boasted that the authorities had managed to steal Jewish property worth 2 million marks. There was one place, though, that was an oasis for Jews, Shanghai. And there's still a synagogue in Shanghai. There were no Jews who lived in Shanghai, but the Chinese make sure that the synagogue is well supported and stays. World leaders did nothing. They sat on their hands. They did absolutely nothing. Desperate Jews attempted to reach any possible destination, and thousands of Jews immigrating during this period to Shanghai, China. At the time, the gates of most countries had been locked before them. The Philippines also emerged as a refugee for about 1,300 Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. That was an American territory at the time. And then there was Kristallnacht, and we're coming up to the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht. November 9th and 10th, Nazi leaders unleashed a series of pogroms, which was an old tactic going back to Russia against the Jewish population in Germany. Well, it wasn't Russia. The Tsars liked it, and recently incorporated territories. This event came to be called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, because of the shattered glass that littered the streets after the vandalism and destruction of Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes. Meanwhile, back in America, hey, we don't want any part of this. We want absolutely no part of this. And we're going to make sure that our politicians know that this is a European thing. We have nothing to do with it. The Neutrality Act of 1935 prohibited exporting arms and ammunition to any foreign nation at war. 1937, a new Neutrality Act prohibited Americans from traveling on ships owned by any belligerent nation and declared that American-owned ships could not carry any arms intended for war zones. In 1938, 20 years after World War I had ended on November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, 70% of Americans polled believed the United States' participation in that war had been a mistake. Well, while this is going on in Europe, there's another problem. Japan invades China. That's Chiang Kai-shek, American ally. It started in 1937 when China began a full-scale resistance to the expansion of Japanese influence in its territory, which had begun in 1931. Franklin Roosevelt's keeping a very close eye on what is happening in China, as it is an American ally, and what is happening with Japan. And he's keeping a wary eye on that, or starts to take a look at what's going on in Japan. For some politicians, there's no isolation. The Naval Act, also known as the Second Vincent Act, becomes law in May. The United States Navy would increase its size and strength by 20%. America is preparing for war. The law was a direct response to the increased aggression from Japan and Germany. Japan had invaded China in 1937, and Germany had annexed Austria in March. The act specifically mandated the construction of 105,000 tons of battleships. So in the back of his mind, and some politicians' mind, they know war is coming. Meanwhile, there's another war, Spanish Civil War. That began in July 1936. A rebel coup took place against the elected Republicans by the military-supported nationalists. The nationalists were backed by Italy and Germany, while the Republicans had Soviet Union support. So for the United States, there's no real friend here with the nationalists. That is Francisco Franco, who was walking the streets. The country of Spain was split in half by two opposing sides. And in 1937, the nationalists gained control of many of the northern provinces. The nationalists kept pushing north, forcing much of the Republican army to flee into France. And the end is near for the Republicans. Franco was appointed head of the Nationalist Army and chief of staff in late 1936. In November, nationalist forces made it to the outside of Madrid and began a siege of the capital. People don't talk about this. It's the Arab Revolt. It starts around 1936. And it's a prelude to what would eventually go on in the Middle East and the two-state solution, and that is still talked about today. But this is the prelude. This is the opening act. In July 1937, a British commission reported that the Arab Revolt starting in 1936 was caused by the Arab desire for independence and concern over the idea of a Jewish national home. The committee advised the partition of Palestine. Two-state solution, right? Additionally, it recommended the compulsory transfer of Arab Palestinians from the territories earmarked for the Jewish state. Arabs are not happy about that. They rejected the proposal, and the revolt was stepped up during 1937 and 1938. So this is happening about, give or take, 10 years before Israel became a country, that there was a revolt against the English because the English wanted a two-state solution. The Depression lingers in the United States. It started in October 1929 over a 5-day period, and there were ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs. The U.S. economy goes back into a recession, which caused the unemployment to rise back to 19%. It was 25% during the early days of the Depression. Meanwhile, there is a law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is signed. It defined the maximum work week as 44 hours in a 7-day week, created a national minimum salary of 25 cents an hour. It also made employers pay employees time and a half for overtime in certain jobs. It also stopped oppressive child labor in most cases. Not in 2023. Watching radio. I do a talk on the early days of radio and the people there were in their 80s and 90s, and do recall watching radio like that. Radio is the theater of the imagination. You have to have an imagination to figure out what is going on radio, because there are no pictures. So you would concentrate, tunnel vision, and listen and listen and listen, and maybe you'll get the War of the Worlds, right? Radio became the dominant entertainment and information source in America by 1938. On March 13th, CBS carried the first point-to-point news roundup, including Edward R. Murrow's first report of Nazi Germany invading Austria. Murrow was not a journalist. He wasn't sent there. He was sent to do business there. Ended up becoming a journalist. On November 10th, the day before Armistice Day, Kate Smith sings God Bless America for the first time on her radio show. And then there was this. Who's on first? What's on second? Third base? I don't know. It was one of America's classic comedy routines. Who's on First was a type of vaudeville act that was common in the vaudeville circuit. It descended from the 20th century, burlesque sketches that used plays on words and names. Bud Abbott said it was taken from an older routine called Who's the Boss? 1993 obituary of comedy sketch writer Michael J. Musto states that shortly after Abbott and Costello teamed up, which was in 1936, they paid Musto $15 to write the script. Now this guy is one of my best friends. His name is Max Docelli. He's a comic. He started with Seinfeld and Larry David and Paul Reiser and Carol Leifler and Gilbert Gottfried in the Caroline circuit in Manhattan. And I said to him, I said, hey Max, you think they ever paid Musto? He said, no, we're comics. We steal everything. Abbott's wife recalled him performing the routine with another comedian before teaming up with Costello. After they formally teamed up in burlesque in 1936, he and Costello continued to hone the sketch. It was a big hit in the fall of 1937. They performed the routine in a touring vaudeville revue called Hollywood Bandwagon on the Kate Smith Show. They go. Now, they weren't supposed to be on the Kate Smith Show. Henny Youngman was supposed to be there. But he gets an opportunity to go into the movies. He's got to take a screen test. He's got to go out to California. So he says to Ted Collins, who's the show's producer and also the band leader and Kate Smith's manager, hey look, I think I got a replacement, Abbott and Costello. And there's Henny Youngman, take my wife, please. Got an offer from Paramount Pictures to go to Hollywood and make a test, but Ted Collins, the producer of the show, said you can't go unless you get a replacement. So I went to the Lowe's State Theater and I saw Abbott and Costello and they were doing a thing called Who's on First. Closed my eyes and visualized that this could be very funny on radio. One of the producers of the Kate Smith Hour didn't like Who's on First, didn't like the bit, after watching Abbott and Costello perform it at a theater. The only way for them to get it on the show was to lie about not having any new material for the week. Because the duo was a big ratings draw, the producers suggested they try out their baseball sketch to fill time, even though they didn't want it. In reality, Abbott and Costello planned the bluff. They saw this as a chance to introduce Who's on First to a wider audience. I'm telling you, Costello, it's going to be a hit. And it was a hit. Abbott and Costello premiered the routine on the Kate Smith Show on March 24th. They may have gotten some help from John Grant and Will Glickman to write the bits. The routine, they were performed, well, it had legs, the routine. It was performed at the White House, performed in movies, radio and TV. Abbott and Costello were enshrined in baseball's Hall of Fame in 1956. And in 2007, Vin Scully, the Los Angeles Dodgers announcer, looks at his monitor and says, who's on first? And that's who was on first, Chin Lung Hu, Los Angeles Dodger player who came up in 2007, and he played baseball in 2007 for the Dodgers, and he's on first. A 1897 book becomes a radio show. Orson Welles. Welles' Mercury Theater on the Air had been on for 17 weeks on CBS. No sponsor, low budget program, but they had a small but loyal following with fresh adaptations of literary classics. Premiered on July 11th with Bram Stoker's Dracula. And this is what Welles said. He stole the idea from the BBC in 1926, but he claimed it as his own. I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening. And here's the show. There's Welles leaving the show. There are the actors. There's the band. It's a 1-hour show. It comes on a half hour, or it comes on the show. The #1 show of the time was Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. And that ended. So you could flip over to hear Orson Welles' show, but you'd miss half of the show. And Welles started out the show saying this is a drama. That's what it is. It's a drama. So a lot of people tuned into the show, and they heard the Martians were in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, now about 10 years ago. This guy was telling me that he was a kid. The guy now is about 97 years old, so it was about 10 years ago. And he said his father, they lived in Princeton, New Jersey. He said his father, gotta get down to the garage, kids. Pick up those shovels, pick up the rakes, pick up whatever you can find. We gotta beat those Martians, because they're right in Grover's Mills. They're 10 minutes away from us. And they waited in the garage and nothing happened. Nothing happened. Wells in his Mercury Theater on Air performed the radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, converting the 40-year-old novel into fake news bulletins describing a Martian invasion of New Jersey. Why New Jersey? Why not Nebraska? New Jersey, of all places. And it described the invasion on October 30th, which also, if people got the hint, was Gate of Hell Night or Devil's Night or Mischief Night, where kids go around, throw eggs at houses and all that other stuff. Well, you know, that would be the in-house joke. Some listeners mistook the bulletins for the real thing, and their anxious phone calls to police, newspaper offices, and radio stations convinced many journalists that the show had caused nationwide hysteria, including that guy who ran down to his garage with his siblings and picked up the rakes and all. Wells is discussing what happened afterwards. The first 2/3 of the 1-hour broadcast was presented as a series of simulated news bulletins. As it sounded real to some, and CBS is getting calls, some of the actors had to go down to the switchboard and try to convince the people, we're just actors. That's all this is actors. It sounded real to some. According to Radiolab, about 12 million people were listening when Wells' broadcast came on the air, or about one in every 12 thought it was true. Some percentage of that 1 million people ran out of their houses, or they went to their garage to pick up a rake. That constitutes a major freakout. Any laws broken? No. Freedom of press, freedom of speech. The Federal Communications Commission investigated the unorthodox program, but no law was broken. Network said, yeah, you know, CBS, NBC, Mutual, yeah, we'll be a bit more cautious in the future. But this broadcast would help Orson Welles land a contract with a Hollywood studio. His next big project, Citizen Kane. That's what they were looking for, a Martian. This is the goodbye. This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character to assure you that War of the Worlds has no further significance than as a holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in the sheet, jumping out of the bush and saying, boom! Hasn't been forgotten in Grover's Mill. You go to Grover's Mill, you will see this monument. Here are the Martians, there's Orson Welles, and here are the families gathered. But there's more than that to that. Every October 30th, yesterday, there is a War of the Worlds celebration in Grover's Mill, complete with costumes and all the other stuff that you would celebrate with. It's their version of remembering a pre-Halloween non-event, the radio show. But some took it seriously, and it showed just how powerful, absolutely powerful, radio was in those days. And the top-rated shows included Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. The two most popular shows on NBC, the Jack Benny program and Edgar Bergen with his dummy. The Bergen and McCarthy Chase and Sanborn Hour, and that coffee is still made, was the first show to rank #1 every month for 2 consecutive years. Radio is powerful, and this guy, well, he was pushing anti-Semitism. The Reverend Charles E. Coughlin was a Hamilton, Ontario, Canadian-born Roman Catholic priest and radio celebrity based in the Detroit suburb of Royal Oak, Michigan. I still do Zoom talks for the Royal Oak Library twice or 3 times a year, even though most people are getting away from Zoom. His sermons aired on Sundays, often featured populist, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic claims. At the peak of his popularity, 4 in every 13 in the United States listened to him. Maybe 40 million people a week. The U.S. had 130 million people. And there he is. He was basically on WJR in Detroit, WGAR in Cleveland. He was on the network, but the networks got, we don't need him, but he was on stations around the country. He linked Jews to the creation and spread of communism, an ideology he hated. He also frequently utilized literary and religious references to spread anti-Semitic stereotypes. Put out a magazine, Social Justice, and here you see the Jewish question. Although it had been proven to be a hoax, Coughlin published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic pamphlet purportedly providing evidence of the international Jewish conspiracy theory to control the world in multiple issues of social justice in 1938. So he's in Royal Oak, and this guy is in Dearborn. Henry Ford's anti-Semitism. 1919, the Dearborn Independent, that was his paper. That was distributed to Ford car dealers, and it published the Protocols of Zion. Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a forgery that came from Russia. Translated into English, it claimed the existence of an international Jewish conspiracy. Jews got together and planned the fate of the world. In 1931, Adolf Hitler said, "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration." So you got him in Dearborn, you got Coughlin in Royal Oak, and you have this guy who's the hero of baseball in Detroit, at least that year, Hank Greenberg. And there was a home run chase. It was 1938, this is Greenberg, and I was now making good as a ball player. Nobody expected war, least of all the ball players. I didn't pay much attention to Hitler at first or read the front pages. And I just went ahead and played. Of course, as time went by, I came to feel that if I, as a Jew, hit a home run, I was hitting one against Hitler. Hank Greenberg led the American League with 58 home runs, drove in 146 runs, hit .315. Some claim Greenberg was intentionally walked to keep from breaking Babe Ruth's home run record of 60 because of anti-Jewish sentiment. Greenberg called the notion crazy stories throughout his life, although some players said it was true. He reached 58 home runs with 5 games to go in the season, went 5 for 18 over those games, about 300. Walked only 4 times, the same rate he had been walked all season. He did lead the American League with 119 walks. Just couldn't do it. Another Detroit guy, Joe Louis. Louis and Schmeling, the fight. It was America against Germany. It's June 22nd. Yankee Stadium. 70,000 people are there to witness a contest that was much more than a boxing bout. It's a grudge match, black against white. African Americans versus Aryan. The so-called land of the free, battling Nazi Germany. Joe Louis, the brown bomber, and Max Schmeling, a German who was supported by Hitler, were the combatants. Although Schmeling would denounce Hitler eventually. Americans were hopeful that this time Louis would reign victorious over the German boxer who had beaten him in 12 rounds 2 years earlier. The fight lasts just 124 seconds, 2 minutes and 4 seconds. Schmeling knocked out, hospitalized. America, particularly black America, wins. Louis remains champion. And speaking of comics and superheroes, Superman, conceived by 2 Jewish guys from Cleveland. The popular comic strip hero, Superman, makes his first appearance during April when Action Comics #1 is published, dated June 1938. That comic in mint shape's worth thousands of dollars. The character was created by the writer Jerry Siegel and the artist Joe Shuster in 1933 when they were teenagers. It was one of the first major superhero characters. 2 Jewish guys create a Superman. Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, well, that was a big movie. It premieres at the Carthay Circle Theater, December 21st, 1937. In 1938, 3 weeks later, it opens at Radio City Music Hall and a theater in Miami. Of course, Radio City and Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. And it had good box office sales. That encouraged RKO Pictures to place the film into general release on February 4th. It became a major box office success. The animated movie is based on the 1812 German fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. That is Eddie Cantor, and he is the guy who leads the push to raise money to fight polio. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis was officially incorporated on January 3rd, and the first March of Dimes radio appeal occurred during the week preceding the birthday ball event scheduled for January 30th. It was the comedian and singer Eddie Cantor who came up with the name March of Dimes. It started the research for the cure of polio. The 1938 legacy, well, I've been out here twice in Pearl Harbor, USS Arizona Museum. The Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. America declared war on Japan on December 8th, 1941. Hitler and Mussolini declared war in the United States December 11th, 1941. And there were those two. In 2018, a forensic study of the remains by Russian intelligence for 7 decades determined with World War II lost, Hitler killed himself in a bunker in Berlin, April 30th, 1945. April 28, 1945, El Duce, Benito Mussolini, and his mistress, Clara Patecchi, are shot by Italian partisans who had captured the couple as they attempted to flee to Switzerland. I'm not sure if this is still there. Prior to COVID-19, there was an exhibit in Lower Manhattan about Holocaust and World War II, Hitler and all. And you walk through this room here, and there is the question, what happened to the Nazis after the war? 2021, a survey said 1 in 10 young Americans believe that the Holocaust never happened. 23% thought it was a myth, or that the number of those killed, 6 million, had been exaggerated. In a 50-state study of, or survey of Americans aged between 18 and 39, 12% said they never heard or thought they never heard the word Holocaust. In August 2022, the Keller Independent School District in Texas pulled Anne Frank's diary adaptation from school bookshelves. In April 2023, Anne Frank's diary, the graphic adaptation, was removed from a library in Vero Beach, Florida High School after a leader of Moms for Liberty. I love these names. Moms for Liberty. Well, whose liberty? Your liberty or my liberty? We're for liberty. We're for freedom. No, you're not. You're taking a book off the shelf. In Indian River County raised an objection. Oh, that book? It's read by every student in German schools, not in Vero Beach. That is the Enola Gay. It's a museum, one of the Smithsonian museums that you have to pay for by Dulles Airport out in Dulles, Virginia. In Hiroshima, 140,000 people ultimately died from the blast, the atomic weapon, but not all perished immediately from the August 6, 1945 bombing. The residual health issues caused by intense radioactive fallout claimed the lives in the months and years afterwards as well. The day after the August 9, 1945 Nagasaki bombing, Harry Truman, the President of the United States, issued his first affirmative command regarding the bomb. No more strikes without me knowing. He never issued the order to drop the bombs. That was done by the military, but he did issue an order to stop them from dropping. That's St. Petersburg about 12 years ago, when you could actually almost go there and not worry about being spied on too much by the Russians. So what happened to the Nazis? Well, 1,600 Nazi scientists would move to America to work on defense programs and the space program, including Wernher von Braun, who was called the father of the American space program. It was called Operation Paperclip. But the Argentines wanted the Nazis, and the president, Juan Perón, actively welcomed Nazis to his country. The Nazis ended up in many countries. The hunt for the Nazis would be global. Soviets would go after the V-2, some of the V-2 rocketry units that they found after World War II, and that is the Soviet hammer and sickle, that was in St. Petersburg, Russia subway. The end of World War II saw the United States and Soviet Union's relationship crumble, with the Cold War starting in 1946. Soviet Union fell in 1991, lasted 74 years, but problems remained between the United States and the successor Russia. Middle East problems, far from being solved. In 1948, a Jewish state, Israel, was established, which led to the first of many Mideast wars. That night, the war started back in May 1948, just hours after Israel declared it was a country. Father Coughlin ended his radio career in 1940 in May. 2 years later, the U.S. government considered charging Coughlin with violating the Espionage Act by publishing enemy propaganda in social justice. Father Coughlin was the originator of hate radio in America, and the man who hired him in Detroit, G.A. Richards, defended him in Richards' fight to keep his radio station licenses in Detroit and Cleveland. Richard was accused of promoting anti-Semitism. At the 1939 New York World's Fair, Eddie Cantor publicly denounced anti-Semitic radio personality Father Charles Coughlin and was dropped by his radio sponsor, R.J. Reynolds Camel Cigarettes. A year and a half later, Cantor was able to return to the air because of help from his friend Jack Benny. And that is social justice with Coughlin. The Catholic Church hierarchy in Detroit ordered Coughlin to cease all non-pastoral activities or risk being excommunicated. He continued to be the parish priest at the Shrine of the Little Flower until his retirement in 1966. He died in October 1979 of illness. 1968, I could have continued. The people would have supported me, but I didn't have the heart left, for my church had spoken. Spain, Cadiz, Spain. During siesta, nothing was open. The Nationalists won the Spanish Civil War, 1939. Franco would hold on to power until his death in 1975. Franco actually rescued many Jews. He is an enigma. Just how many Jews saved? Unknown. I met one back in January who told me that her family was leaving Amsterdam, had to go through Spain and to get to wherever they were going in North America, and Spanish let them through. They never stopped them. So he's credited with saving somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 Jews. 45,000 may be the likely figure. Now, he doesn't recognize Israel's statehood, yet strong relationships with the Arab world. Yet, on December 16, 1968, the Spanish government formally revoked the 1492 Edict of Expulsion against Spain's Jewish population. That thing lasted for a long, long time, nearly 500 years. China, free of Japan, would see a civil war and become a communist country in 1949. That is Rostock, Germany, former East Germany, and no Nazis. You can't have Nazis around. The Allies split Germany in two after World War II. The Americans, British, and France ran West Germany, East Berlin, and West Berlin. East Germany and East Berlin became a Soviet Union client state. On October 30th, 1990, East and West Germany reunited after 45 years. After the war ended in 1945, the Allies occupied West Germany, outlawed the Nazi Party, and worked to purge its influence from every aspect of German life. West Germany, and now Germany, has strict laws on banning political parties. Only two have been outlawed since the defeat of the Nazis at the end of World War II. The neo-Nazi Socialist Reich Party in 1952 and the German Communist Party in 1956. Partially thanks to people like Alphonse D'Amato, Jews have gotten some money back from the land that was stolen. Germany, in 2023, agreed to pay approximately 1.2 billion euros to Holocaust survivors living around the world. Their total compensation, $80 billion. Israel became a country in 1948. Tensions have never eased in the Middle East. There is Hank Greenberg. Hank Greenberg was the first Major League Baseball player to enlist for action in World War II. never came close to hitting 58 home runs again. During the war, Joe Louis fought 96 exhibition matches before 2 million troops. He donated more than $100,000 to Army and Navy relief efforts. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. That is the Arkansas governor, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And she has no problems revoking child labor laws, and other states as well. Child labor laws were under attack in states across America in the 2020s. In 2023, 8 bills to weaken child labor protections were introduced in Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, and South Dakota. Most of those states are run by Republican governors, Minnesota's a Democratic governor. In Arkansas, a bill repealing restrictions on work for 14 and 15-year-olds has been signed into law by Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders. The law weakens official oversight of child labor practices around the state. Lose an arm when you're a 14-year-old working somewhere, not our problem, we're not protecting you. The battle over the minimum wage is still being fought. Polio. Salk's vaccine works. The first effective polio vaccine was developed in 1952 by Dr. John Salk and his team at the University of Pittsburgh. Salk's polio vaccine was licensed in 1955. He did not patent it. He gave it away. He gave it away. Why should I make money in preventing illness? Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman, worked on the character until they were fired. They were the ones who created it, and they were fired in 1947. They made very little money off the character. They sold their rights for $130. That was it. Action Comics issue #1, the first featured Superman, is considered the most valuable of comic books ever created, recently sold for $3 million. The Superman franchise today includes movies, TV shows, and is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Snow White is regarded as a classic film. That is me interviewing Jack Kemp, who ran for president in 1980. Orson Welles, I'm talking about radio here, that's why the picture is up there. I was 23 years old, working for WGRC Radio. And that was Spark Hill, New York, and that 23-year-old would never get that opportunity because radio doesn't really have news departments anymore, and presidential candidates are now handled by people, and they would never do a one-on-one. Orson Welles' next project, Citizen Kane. Abbott and Costello, huge stars. The AM band on radio barely clings to life with suggestions the band should disappear. Electric vehicle car makers have dropped AM radios because of interference. Radio stations have very little value. Yet radio can be reliable in a disaster because this thing is not going to work during a disaster because the towers are down. TV is not going to work. This thing's not going to work because the internet's down. But portable radios with batteries will work. And radio towers will work with generators. So in that sense, radio could be very reliable in a disaster. Whoa! Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions or comments.